All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're asking a really fundamental question. How do we truly know what we know about the first centuries of Islam? We're going to explore some incredible historical research that looks at the very foundation of the texts that shape our entire understanding of this critical period. So let's kick things off with a single number, 0. That's how many books, apart from the Quran, of course, have survived from the first full century of Islam, not one. And that one simple fact is what kicks off this whole incredible historical puzzle we're going to unpack today. And that leads to the really big question, right? If the foundational books, the ones that detail the Prophet's life and give context to the Quran, were all written centuries after the events they describe, well, how can we bridge that huge gap in time? How do we get back to what actually happened? So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we're going to look at that 200-year gap, that period of silence. Then we'll explore why a growing empire suddenly needed all these texts. We'll jump into the fierce intellectual battles that were raging, see how power can shape history, and finally, we'll connect it all back to the present day. Okay, first up, the 200 years silence. We're starting at the heart of the mystery here. This huge, nearly 2-century gap between the Prophet's life and the books that now define what we call traditional Islam. The source we're looking at uses this really powerful image. It calls this period a long, dark tunnel. Just think about that. For 200 years, the history was almost entirely oral, passed down from one person to another. Imagine trying to piece together a story when nobody wrote anything down for that long. It's a huge, huge challenge for any historian. Now, take a look at this timeline. What's so striking isn't just the dates themselves, but look at how tightly packed they are. You have this long silence after the Prophet's death, and then bam, around the 200-year mark, there's this sudden explosion of writing. The Prophet's biography, the legal frameworks, the massive collections of his sayings, the whole foundation of traditional Islam, it all just appears in this relatively short window, long, long after the events themselves. Okay, before we go any further, let's get a couple of key terms straight, because we're going to be using them a lot. The Sirah is the Prophet's life story, his biography. The Sahih Hadith, on the other hand, are collections of reports about what he said and did. These two things together form the basis of the Sunnah, the Prophet's example, which is absolutely central to Islamic law. So why? Why this sudden burst of activity in the 3rd century? Well, the source we're exploring argues that this wasn't just a bunch of scholars getting together in a library. Oh no, this was a political necessity, driven by the needs of a new, sprawling empire. You have to picture the Abbasid Empire at this time. It was massive, right? A huge, sprawling mix of Arabs, Persians, and all sorts of other groups. How do you govern millions of people with different traditions and beliefs? The solution, this source argues, was to create a single, unified, official version of Islam. A set of canonical books could give everyone a common legal and social framework and help hold the empire together. And where did they start? Well, they started by trying to standardize the law, or what's known as fiqh. But this effort to create a single coherent legal system actually led to the formation of different schools of thought, or madhabs, each with its own way of doing things. And this created a whole new problem. I mean, look at this. You've got the Maliki school in Medina and the Hanafi school out in Persia, and they're disagreeing on really fundamental stuff, like how you stand in prayer or even whether you could drink a mild beer. A key scholar at the time, Imam Shafi, he's looking at all this and thinking, whoa, this is a mess. We're drifting way too far from the Prophet's original example, the Sunnah. Because check this out, it's a huge paradox. The second caliph, Umar, one of the Prophet's closest companions, right? He flat out said no to collecting the hadith. He was worried they might start to compete with the Quran itself. But fast forward less than 100 years, and another caliph is officially ordering their collection. That's a massive U-turn, and it shows you how the practical needs of running an empire were starting to change things. And you have to remember the world this was all happening in. This was not some peaceful academic retreat. The source calls it a Game of Thrones era, and that's a perfect description. We're talking violent coups, capitals moving all over the place, and brutal sectarian splits. That's the chaotic, high-stakes world these foundational texts were born into. And that political chaos, well, it had an intellectual twin, an equally fierce, equally high-stakes battle for the very soul of Islam, a war over reason, revelation, and the nature of truth itself. So you basically had two major camps in this intellectual war. On one side, you have the rationalists, the Mutazilites. Their whole thing was open reason. They were saying, hey, let's use every tool we have, Greek philosophy, logic, you name it, to understand the Quran. But on the other side, you had the traditionalists. Their view was closed reason. They were like, no, reason has to stay inside the sandbox of the Quran and the Hadith. If we start bringing in outside ideas, we're going to corrupt the whole message. And this wasn't just some friendly debate. This became state policy. First, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun goes all in on the rationalists. He even started an inquisition, the Mihna, to force this view on everyone. The great traditionalist scholar Imam Ibn Hanbal resisted and was thrown in prison. But then, in this incredible flip-flop, a later caliph comes in, reverses everything, ends the inquisition, and makes the traditionalist view the law of the land. It just goes to show how quickly political power could define religious truth. So you see where this is going, right? With all this political chaos and these intense ideological wars, where the government is literally jailing people for their beliefs, how can we be sure the history that comes down to us is, unbiased? The source gives us a really sharp analogy to think about this. Would you trust a history of the American Civil War if it was written by a Northern historian who took the only copy of a Southern historian's account, edited out the parts he didn't like, and then destroyed the original? Probably not, right? Well, that's kind of what happened with the first biography of the Prophet. The earliest version, by a scholar named Ibn Ishaq, has vanished. The one we have is an edited version by a later scholar, Ibn Hisham, who admitted he cut things out. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. The source points to a real climate of coercion. I mean, just look at this. The 4 founders of the main Sunni law schools, all of them were imprisoned at some point. Imam Abu Hanifa literally died in prison. This wasn't just a debate, it was dangerous. The idea of academic freedom we value so much today just didn't exist. And this quote from the scholar Talal Asad just nails it. He says, "Orthodoxy is not a mere body of opinion, but a distinctive relationship, a relationship of power." What he means is the right version of the religion wasn't necessarily decided by who had the best argument. It was often decided by who had the power of the state behind them. Okay, so let's bring this all home. What's the lasting impact of this whole process? How does this ancient history of political pressure and canon building affect things today? The source argues that the creation of this official canon, forged in the fires of imperial politics, led to what it calls a cult of certitude. It created an atmosphere where these texts, written centuries after the fact, were put on such a high pedestal that it became almost taboo to ask critical, historical questions about them. Now, to be clear, the traditional scholars had this incredibly sophisticated system for verifying stories, called the isnad. They'd meticulously check the chain of people who passed a story down. It was a brilliant system for judging the reliability of the narrators. But the source also points out the system's one major weakness. It's a system for verifying an oral chain of transmission over 200 years, with no contemporary written documents to check it against. And you can see this tension play out perfectly in a modern debate about a place called Baka that's mentioned in the Quran. The traditional narrative, based on the Sirah and Hadith, says Baka is just an old name for Makkah. Simple enough. But some modern historians have a different theory. They look at old maps, the history of civil wars, and they suggest, wait a minute, what if Baka was actually somewhere near Jerusalem, and the story got rewritten later by a victorious caliph? But and this is a really important point. After laying out this fascinating alternative, what does the source material itself conclude? It says that since there are 0 facts on the ground to prove the revisionist theory, the only intellectually honest position is to stick with the traditional view. It's a fantastic example of prioritizing hard evidence over exciting but unproven speculation. So why do we cling so tightly to this idea of absolute historical certainty? Well, the source suggests there's a deep psychological need at play. In a world that feels chaotic and confusing, having a story that gives you concrete, unshakable answers about where you came from and where you're going, that's incredibly comforting. It creates what the source calls a cocoon of certitude. And that brings us to the final, really challenging question that this whole investigation leaves us with. If we acknowledge the gaps in the record, if we understand the political pressures that shape these texts, what is the most intellectually honest way forward for historians and for people of faith? And the source leaves us with this powerful insight, not from a modern critic, but from Imam Malik, one of the foundational jurists of Sunni Islam. He said, "The best shield of a scholar is to say, I don't know." This suggests that true knowledge and intellectual integrity begin not with absolute certitude, but with the humility to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and to recognize the difference between what can be known and what must remain a matter of faith.